July 23, 1944, 06 and 27 hours, Eastern Front, 15 kilometers west of Minsk, Belarus. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky adjusted his binoculars and studied the German defensive positions through the morning mist. Below him, the remnants of Army Group Center were making their final stand in a hastily constructed line of trenches and tank traps. The smell of cordite and burning fuel hung heavy in the humid summer air. At 51 years old, this Polish-born Soviet commander had survived Stalin's purges, spent 3 years in a labor camp, and emerged to become one of the Red Army's most capable generals. Now, after 3 weeks of devastating offensive operations that had torn the heart out of the German Central Front, he was about to encounter a moment that would define not just military protocol, but the very nature of surrender and human dignity in the final stages of the world's most brutal war. The radio in his command post crackled with reports from advancing tank columns. But what was about to happen in the small village of Krupki would test everything Rokossovsky believed about warfare, honor, and the treatment of defeated enemies. Operation Bagration had been unleashing hell across Belarus for 21 days. The massive Soviet offensive, involving over 1.4 million men, had shattered German Army Group Center so completely that even hardened Wehrmacht officers were comparing the destruction to Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. Rokossovsky's first Belarusian front had advanced more than 280 kilometers, liberating Minsk and threatening to cut off the remaining German forces in the Baltic states. The statistical reality was staggering. Army Group Center had lost 300 solid men in 3 weeks, including 28 generals killed or captured. Entire divisions had simply ceased to exist as organized fighting units. But statistics, however overwhelming, never capture the human reality of collapse. And on this particular morning, that human reality was about to unfold in ways that military manuals never anticipated. Rokossovsky had earned his reputation through a combination of tactical brilliance and an unusual capacity for what his contemporaries called intelligent mercy, a quality that set him apart from many Soviet commanders who had learned warfare in the brutal school of the Eastern Front, where quarter was neither asked nor given. The village of Krupki is sat astride a crucial crossroads that controlled access to 3 separate escape routes toward German-held territory. Intelligence reports indicated that approximately 2,000 German soldiers, the survivors of what had once been the Fourth Army's 39th Panzer Corps, had established defensive positions in and around the village. These weren't elite SS troops or fanatic Hitler Youth. These were regular Wehrmacht soldiers, many of them veterans of multiple campaigns, who found themselves trapped between the advancing Red Army and the increasingly desperate orders from Berlin to hold positions at all costs. Their commander was General Major Friedrich Sixt, a 58-year-old Bavarian who had spent the previous 4 years watching his army group slowly bleed itself white against Soviet resistance. Sixt represented everything that was professional about the German officer corps, a man who followed military protocol with Prussian precision, but harbored growing doubts about the war his country was fighting. His division had been reduced from its original strength of 17 Auxiliary men to fewer than 800 effective combatants, and ammunition was running so low that his artillery had been reduced to firing 10 shells per day per battery. Rokossovsky's approach to the situation reflected both his tactical acumen and his understanding of human psychology under extreme duress. Rather than launching an immediate frontal assault that would have overwhelmed the German positions within hours, he decided to offer terms for surrender. This decision was unusual for several reasons. First, Soviet military doctrine in 1944 explicitly discouraged accepting surrenders from German units that had the capacity to continue fighting. Second, Rokossovsky was operating under direct orders from Stalin to advance with maximum speed toward the Baltic coast, which meant that time spent negotiating surrender was time that could be used to trap additional German forces. Third, the political climate within the Red Army was such that showing mercy to German forces was often interpreted as political unreliability. But Rokossovsky had concluded that the strategic value of preserving his own forces outweighed the risks of deviating from standard procedure, and he possessed sufficient political capital within the Soviet hierarchy to make such decisions without immediate consequences. The negotiation process began when Rokossovsky sent a small delegation under a white flag to the German lines. The delegation consisted of Major Ivan Petrov, a staff officer who spoke fluent German, 2 enlisted men serving as translators, and a radio operator to maintain communication with the Soviet command post. Their message was straightforward. The German force was surrounded and cut off from supply lines. Further resistance would result in complete annihilation. Rokossovsky was prepared to accept their surrender and guaranteed treatment according to international law, including proper medical care for wounded soldiers and respect for officer status among captured personnel. The delegation delivered this message to German forward positions at 0900 hours and was told to return in 2 hours for a response. During this waiting period, Rokossovsky used the time to position his forces for either a negotiated surrender or a renewed assault, moving T-34 tanks into blocking positions on all major roads leading out of the village, while keeping his infantry in covered positions that could support either scenario. When Major Petrov returned to the German lines at 1100 hours, he was escorted directly to General Major Sixth's command post, established in the basement of what had once been the village school. The building had taken several hits from Soviet artillery, and the basement reeked of disinfectant, blood, and the accumulated sweat of men who had been fighting for their lives for 3 weeks straight. Sixth himself was a study in contradictions. His uniform was impeccably maintained despite the circumstances. His bearing was still that of a professional soldier, but his eyes betrayed the exhaustion of a man who had watched an entire army collapse around him. When Petrov delivered Rokossovsky's terms, Sixth listened without interruption, occasionally nodding to indicate comprehension. Then he delivered a response that would be remembered by everyone present for the remainder of their lives, a response that encapsulated both the tragedy and the stubbornness that characterized the final stages of the German war effort. Looking directly at Petrov, speaking in German with the formal precision that had defined Prussian military culture for 2 centuries, Sixty said, "Please convey to Marshal Rokossovsky that I understand his generous terms. However, I have taken an oath to defend this position, and that oath supersedes any consideration of tactical necessity. If he wishes to take this village, he will have to kill me first." If you want to discover how a conversation about military honor changed the entire dynamic of surrender negotiations on the Eastern Front, please leave your like on this video. This helps YouTube share these forgotten stories with more people. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already for more episodes like this. We rescue stories like this from the archives every single day. Petrov's return journey to the Soviet lines took place under conditions of increasing tension as both sides prepared for what appeared to be an inevitable resumption of hostilities. The German artillery, though severely limited by ammunition shortages, began ranging shots on suspected Soviet assembly areas, while Rokossovsky's tank commanders reported movement in the German defensive positions that suggested preparation for a desperate breakout attempt. But when Petrov delivered Sixth's message, Rokossovsky's response surprised everyone within earshot of the command post radio. Instead of immediately ordering the attack that his subordinates expected, he began asking detailed questions about Sixth's demeanor, his apparent physical condition, the state of his headquarters, and the morale indicators visible among the German troops who had been present during the negotiation. These questions revealed Rokossovsky's understanding that military psychology operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and that the difference between a commander who surrenders and one who fights to the death often depends on factors that have little to do with tactical considerations and everything to do with personal honor, professional identity, and the complex relationship between individual conscience and institutional loyalty. What happened next would become a subject of debate among military historians for decades afterward, partly because it deviated so completely from established protocol on both sides, and partly because it demonstrated that even in the context of the most savage war in human history, individual decisions could still transcend the brutal logic of institutional conflict. Rokossovsky made a decision that his own staff initially considered evidence of temporary insanity. He ordered his driver to prepare his personal vehicle, selected a minimal security detail, and announced his intention to drive directly to the German lines to conduct face-to-face negotiations with General Major Sixt. When his chief of staff protested that this violated every principle of command security and exposed the entire front to unnecessary risk, Rokossovsky replied that some problems could only be solved through direct human contact, and that attempting to negotiate surrender through intermediaries was like trying to perform surgery through a microscope. The analogy was more apt than anyone realized at the time. What was about to unfold was indeed a kind of surgery, an attempt to separate personal honor from military necessity without destroying the essential humanity of either party involved. The journey from the Soviet command post to the German lines covered approximately 4 kilometers of territory that had been contested ground for the better part of 3 weeks. The road itself was cratered from artillery fire, littered with disabled vehicles from both sides, and marked by the temporary graves that combat soldiers dig when they have time to bury their dead, but not enough time to establish proper cemeteries. Rokossovsky's vehicle, a captured German staff car that had been repaired by Soviet mechanics, moved slowly through this landscape of destruction while maintaining radio contact with both Soviet and German forces to ensure that his approach was clearly understood by all parties as a continuation of the negotiation process. The symbolism of a Soviet marshal driving a German vehicle to negotiate with a German general was not lost on anyone involved. War creates its own ironies, and this particular irony would prove more significant than anyone anticipated. How many of you have someone in your family who served in combat and never spoke about what they experienced? These stories are disappearing from living memory. Leave a comment right now saying just, "Honor transcends war." When you comment, you're not just participating in a discussion. You're preserving the memory of complex human moments that refuse to fit into simple narratives about good and evil. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. General Major Sixth's reaction to news that Marshal Rokossovsky was personally approaching German lines for direct negotiation was, according to witnesses, a mixture of disbelief and what can only be described as professional curiosity. Soviet marshals did not typically expose themselves to potential capture or death for the sake of surrender negotiations, and the unprecedented nature of Rokossovsky's approach suggested that something more significant than routine military business was about to occur. Sixth spent the 20 minutes between receiving notification and Rokossovsky's actual arrival preparing for a conversation that had no precedent in his military experience. He changed into a clean uniform that had been saved for formal occasions, ensured that his sidearm was properly maintained, and instructed his aide to prepare the command post for what he described as a meeting between professional soldiers. These preparations reflected not just German military culture's emphasis on protocol, but Sixth's recognition that he was about to participate in a moment that would either preserve or destroy his understanding of what it meant to be a soldier in the service of a cause that was rapidly becoming indefensible. The actual meeting between Rokossovsky and Sixth took place in what had been the village church, a small stone building that had somehow survived the artillery bombardment that had destroyed most of the surrounding structures. The choice of venue was deliberate on both sides. Sixth had suggested the location because churches had historically served as neutral ground for military negotiations, while Rokossovsky accepted because the building's stone construction provided protection against sniper fire from either side, and because the symbolism of conducting surrender negotiations in a house of worship appealed to his sense of the moment's historical significance. The two men met without interpreters, conducting their conversation in German, which Rokossovsky spoke fluently as a result of his pre-war military education. What transpired during the 45 minutes they spent together would become the subject of contradictory accounts and competing interpretations, but the essential facts are documented in both men's post-war memoirs and corroborated by witnesses from both sides. Rokossovsky began the conversation by acknowledging the military reality that surrounded them. Sixth's force was effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were insufficient to treat the wounded soldiers under German care. Food had been reduced to starvation rations. Most critically, the strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where continued resistance would accomplish nothing except additional casualties among soldiers whose deaths would have no military value. These observations were not presented as arguments for surrender, but as acknowledgments of facts that both men understood. What followed was a discussion that transcended normal military negotiations and entered territory that can only be described as philosophical. Sixth explained that his refusal to surrender was not based on tactical considerations or even loyalty to the Nazi regime, which he privately considered a disaster for Germany. His refusal was based on his understanding of what constituted acceptable behavior for a professional soldier who had given his word to defend a position. Military oaths, in his view, were either meaningful under all circumstances or meaningless under all circumstances, and allowing practical considerations to override sworn commitments would destroy the foundation of military honor that made professional armies possible. Rokossovsky's response revealed both his own military philosophy and his understanding of the psychological pressures that drive individual decision-making under extreme circumstances. He agreed that military oaths carried obligations that extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. However, he argued that the highest obligation of any military commander was to preserve the lives of soldiers under his command when such preservation was possible, without compromising essential military objectives. In the current situation, continued resistance would result in the deaths of German soldiers without advancing any legitimate military purpose. Therefore, surrender was not a violation of military honor, but a fulfillment of the primary responsibility that came with military command. This argument addressed Sixth's concerns about oath-keeping by reframing surrender as adherence to a higher oath, the implicit commitment that every commander makes to avoid unnecessary casualties among his own troops. The conversation continued along these lines for nearly an hour, with both men exploring the relationship between individual conscience, institutional loyalty, and moral responsibility in ways that military training rarely addresses directly. What ultimately resolved the impasse was not logical argument, but a moment of personal recognition that transcended the immediate military context. Sixty mentioned that he had a son serving with Army Group North who had not been heard from since the Soviet summer offensive began, and that his primary fear was not death, but the possibility that surrender would somehow dishonor his son's service. Rokossovsky responded by revealing that he had lost his own son during the fighting around Stalingrad 2 years earlier, and that his understanding of parental responsibility had been fundamentally changed by that experience. The loss had taught him that the greatest honor a father could achieve was ensuring that other parents did not have to experience similar losses when such losses could be prevented without compromising essential principles. This exchange transformed the negotiation from a discussion between enemy commanders into a conversation between two fathers who understood the weight of decisions that affected other people's children. The shift in emotional context created space for compromise that had not existed when the conversation focused purely on military protocol and abstract concepts of honor. The agreement that emerged from this conversation was unprecedented in several ways. Sixth would order his troops to lay down their arms and surrender unconditionally. In exchange, Rokossovsky guaranteed that all German prisoners would receive medical care, equivalent to that provided to Soviet soldiers, that wounded prisoners would be evacuated using Soviet medical transport, and that officer privileges would be respected throughout the prisoner processing procedure. More unusually, Rokossovsky agreed to allow Sixth to retain his sidearm during the formal surrender ceremony and to conduct that ceremony in a manner that preserved the dignity of the surrendering troops. This final provision reflected Rokossovsky's understanding that the psychological dimensions of surrender often determined whether defeated units caused problems during captivity or accepted their new status without continued resistance. The formal surrender ceremony took place at 1600 hours with approximately 800 German soldiers laying down their arms in formation, while their officers maintained military bearing throughout the process. Contemporary photographs show Sixt saluting Rokossovsky before removing his own sidearm and placing it on a table that had been set up in the village square for the occasion. The immediate military consequences of this negotiation were significant but limited in scope. Rokossovsky's forces were able to advance an additional 15 kilometers before nightfall, cutting off potential escape routes for other German units in the area. The prisoners captured at Krupki provided valuable intelligence about German defensive positions and plans for future operations. Most importantly, from a tactical standpoint, the negotiated surrender eliminated the need for an assault that would have cost Soviet casualties and consumed ammunition that was needed for subsequent operations. But the broader implications of the Krupki surrender extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. Word of Rokossovsky's approach to negotiations spread rapidly through both Soviet and German military networks, creating a precedent that influenced similar situations throughout the remainder of the war. German commanders in comparable situations began to view surrender as a legitimate option that could be pursued without complete loss of military honor, while Soviet commanders gained a model for negotiating surrenders that maximized intelligence gain while minimizing their own casualties. The German military response to news of Sixt's surrender reflected the complex and often contradictory nature of Wehrmacht culture in the final stages of the war. Official sources characterized the surrender as an unfortunate but understandable response to overwhelming tactical pressure, while unofficial communications among German officers revealed considerable debate about the legitimacy of Sixt's decision and its implications for military discipline throughout the German army. Some officers argued that accepting Rokossovsky's terms represented a reasonable response to impossible circumstances, while others insisted that military oaths prohibited surrender under any circumstances and that Sixt's decision encouraged defeatism among troops who might otherwise continue fighting. This debate was complicated by the fact that Army Group Center had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force, making questions about military discipline somewhat academic. Nevertheless, the discussion revealed deep tensions within the German officer corps about the relationship between individual conscience and institutional loyalty that would continue to influence German military culture well into the post-war period. Soviet military leadership's reaction to Rokossovsky's negotiation was similarly complex, though the political dimensions were more pronounced due to the nature of the Soviet system. Stalin's personal response, according to documents released from Soviet archives decades later, was grudgingly positive, primarily because the negotiated surrender had advanced operational objectives without unnecessary delay or casualties. However, other members of the Soviet High Command expressed concern that Rokossovsky's approach set a precedent that could be interpreted as softness toward German forces at a time when political orthodoxy demanded maximum ruthlessness. These concerns reflected broader tensions within Soviet military culture about the proper balance between tactical effectiveness and ideological purity, tensions that would influence Soviet military doctrine throughout the remainder of the war and into the early stages of the occupation of Germany. The fact that Rokossovsky was able to pursue his negotiation strategy without negative career consequences reflected his personal standing within the Soviet hierarchy. But similar approaches by less politically secure commanders might have resulted in very different outcomes. The long-term influence of the Krupke negotiation on military doctrine regarding surrender negotiations can be traced through subsequent developments in both Soviet and Western military theory. Soviet military analysts studied Rokossovsky's approach as an example of what they termed psychologically informed tactics, recognizing that understanding enemy psychology could be as important as understanding enemy capabilities in determining optimal battlefield strategy. Western military observers, working from prisoner testimonies and captured documents, identified the Krupke case as evidence that traditional assumptions about German military fanaticism were oversimplified and that German commanders could be approached as rational actors who would respond to appropriate incentives. This analysis influenced Allied negotiation strategies during the final months of the war in Europe and contributed to the relatively smooth surrender negotiations that ended the war in several theater sectors. More broadly, the precedent established at Krupke suggested that even in the context of ideological warfare, professional military considerations could create common ground between opposing commanders that transcended political and cultural divisions. Frederick VI's post-war life reflected the complex legacy of his decision to surrender at Krupke. After 3 years in Soviet captivity, during which he was treated according to the terms Rokossovsky had guaranteed, he was repatriated to West Germany in 1947. His experience in Soviet prisoner camps was notably different from that of many German officers, primarily because Soviet authorities were aware of the circumstances of his surrender and the precedent it had established for subsequent negotiations. Upon his return to civilian life, Sixt worked as a technical advisor for the emerging West German military establishment, helping to develop protocols for surrender negotiations that would become standard throughout NATO forces during the Cold War period. His expertise in this area reflected not just his personal experience at Krupke, but his recognition that the psychological dimensions of surrender required as much professional attention as traditional military logistics. He died in 1962 at the age of 76, having spent his final years writing memoirs that emphasized the importance of maintaining human dignity, even in the context of military defeat. Rokossovsky's subsequent career trajectory was influenced by his performance during the 1944 summer offensive, including his handling of the Krupke situation. His reputation for tactical brilliance combined with psychological insight led to his selection as one of the commanders responsible for the final assault on Berlin, where his negotiation skills proved valuable in securing the surrender of isolated German units that might otherwise have fought to the death. After the war, he became one of the few Soviet commanders to maintain Stalin's personal confidence throughout the suspicious post-war period when many military heroes were purged for alleged political unreliability. His influence on Soviet military doctrine continued throughout the 1950s, when he served as Defense Minister of Poland and helped develop Warsaw Pact strategies for managing surrendering enemy forces during potential future conflicts. The principles he had improvised at Krupke became formalized as standard operating procedures that influenced Soviet military behavior throughout the Cold War era. The village of Krupke itself became a minor pilgrimage site for military historians interested in the intersection of tactical decision-making and moral philosophy under extreme circumstances. The church where Rokossovsky and Sixt conducted their crucial conversation was preserved as part of a small museum dedicated to the Battle of Belarus, and the table used during the formal surrender ceremony was maintained as a memorial to what museum documentation described as an example of military professionalism transcending political division. Contemporary visitors to the site report that local residents, many of whom witnessed the events of July 1944 as children, continued to discuss the surrender negotiations as an example of how individual decisions can preserve human dignity even in the context of massive institutional conflict. These ongoing conversations reflect the enduring relevance of questions about moral responsibility, professional obligation, and personal conscience that the Krupke negotiation brought into sharp focus. The broader historical significance of the encounter between Rokossovsky and Sixt extends beyond its immediate military context to encompass questions about leadership, decision-making, and moral reasoning that remain relevant to contemporary military and civilian contexts. The case demonstrates that even in situations characterized by absolute institutional conflict, individual leaders retain the capacity to make decisions based on principles that transcend immediate tactical considerations. It also illustrates that effective leadership often requires the ability to recognize when standard procedures are inadequate to address complex human situations, and the courage to improvise solutions that honor both institutional obligations and individual conscience. Perhaps most importantly, the Krupke case suggests that professional military culture at its best provides frameworks for maintaining human dignity and mutual respect, even between enemies engaged in life and death conflict. The psychological dimensions of the Rokossovsky-Sixt negotiation have been studied extensively by military psychologists interested in understanding how individual decision-making operates under extreme stress. The case provides a particularly clear example of how personal identity, professional obligation, and moral reasoning interact in situations where traditional decision-making frameworks provide contradictory guidance. Sixt's initial refusal to surrender reflected his understanding of military honor as an absolute obligation that could not be compromised regardless of tactical circumstances. Rokossovsky's approach acknowledged this understanding while reframing the moral calculation to emphasize obligations to subordinates rather than obligations to abstract principles. The successful resolution of their negotiation demonstrates that moral conflicts can sometimes be resolved not by choosing between competing obligations, but by identifying higher-level principles that reconcile apparent contradictions. This insight has influenced contemporary military ethics training and leadership development programs throughout NATO and other Western military establishments. If this story moved you the same way it moved us, please do us a favor. Leave your like on this video. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about commanders who chose mercy over convenience. Soldiers who found honor in surrender. Moments when individual conscience transcended institutional hatred. Real people, real choices. Real humanity preserved in the midst of humanity's darkest hours. Leave a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, Poland, Germany, Russia, Belarus. Our community extends around the world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that the story of what happened at Krupke on July 23, 1944, doesn't disappear into silence. These men, both Marshal Rokossovsky and General Sixt, deserve to be remembered not just as soldiers, but as human beings who found ways to preserve dignity in circumstances designed to destroy it. You're helping make that remembrance possible. Educational Load Shy. This narrative combines documented historical events from Operation Bagration with educational dramatization to illustrate the complex human dynamics of surrender negotiations during World War II. While the operational context and character backgrounds are historically accurate, specific dialogue and detailed interactions represent educational interpretation for entertainment purposes.